Jeff Scott, college football playoff week, brother.
All right, let's go.
Oh, man. So I just thought it would be a good place to start, honestly, by talking about how the selection committee makes the selection to begin with, just in terms of how they narrow the teams down for the top three and then start that process over again. So if you could review that real quick before we kind of dive into the teams, I think that would be helpful to some people.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's very unique. This committee, which people are, I guess, kind of chosen to be on the committee, invited to be on the committee. They meet starting really kind of the second half of the season, so they don't really, meet at the beginning of the year. It's right there, I believe, right around the end of October, beginning of November is when they start meeting. And one thing that I think's unique that a lot of people may not know is they look at everything. I mean, they look at stats. I mean, they get in the weeds on all the different stats: offense, defense, special teams, strategy, style of offense, style of defense. I think the committee is made up of some administrators, athletic directors, and then also some guys that have formerly coached in the past and can maybe give some insight there, and then some people that are really outside of the AD coach's role. So pretty unique. I think this is the last year. So the playoffs started in 2014. So this is the 10th season that they've had it, and this is the last year of the current setup with 4 teams. And starting next year, it'll go to 12 teams, and all the drama that we had yesterday will not really exist, in my opinion, when they go to 12 teams. I know the individual teams and conferences can argue for who should be 12th to make the playoff, but that's a lot different argument than who should be in the top 4. So I think it'll definitely help some of the issues that they experienced yesterday.
Yeah, and I don't think that conversation about who's 12 versus
Right.
13 is going to be nearly as compelling as the one we've been having. Before we dive into all these teams, out of curiosity, do you think some of, I don't know, the gravitas, whatever you want to call it, I think there's a certain suspense around who's going to get in, who's not going to get in. I do think that the regular season games mean more when you're in a format like this. Do you think anything is going to be lost in college football by kind of going to this more 12 team format, or do you think it's just going to be shifted to, I mean, it almost feels like to me like we're going back to a bowl system again, where the big bowl games matter again, as opposed to it being just like these 1 or 2 games that matter?
Yeah, well, I think overall I'm for the 12 team playoff overall, but will we
You're,
leave?
as a ball coach, yeah, I
Yeah,
would imagine.
and and just that I think a case could definitely be made for both Florida State and for Georgia that they could have a chance. At least they have a good enough team, and to have, especially Georgia, and so
Right.
with it being limited to 4, there's not been many years where I would say that the 5th or 6th team, but there's definitely been some, and this is one for sure. Now, I think the excitement of playoff football with more teams involved, I think it definitely is going to add some excitement. But probably one negative, and we're already seeing that a little bit with a 4-team playoff, and we're really going to see it with a 12-team playoff, is it's going to be very hard for the bowls and for TV to keep the bowls outside of the 12-team playoff, meaning anything. Again, we're already seeing that with just a 4-team playoff. Teams that don't make the playoff, a lot of their players don't want to play. I mean, you're seeing kids get in the portal where teams still have bowl games, and so I think that's going to be the other side of the coin. Is you're going to have a 12-team playoff, and then you're going to have the NIT basically, which is all the other bowl games outside of that, and then the other
But
challenge.
don't you almost feel like that's kind of the way, like, to me, the way I look at it is, at least we're going to have 6 good games for that are all going to matter. Whereas right now it's like we have 2 and the rest of it's the NIT,
No,
at least in terms of the way I look at it.
yeah, no, I agree. I'm for it. I'm just
Yeah.
saying the
It's just not
traditionalist,
optimal.
right? That
Yeah.
is looking at all the history of the bowl games and all those things. You're going to lose something there, and then and again, we already have this a little bit with the 14 playoff, but you're definitely going to have it with a 12-team playoff. I mean, pretty much every Power 5 school, their AD and their administration and boosters are going to have a goal of making the 12-team playoff, and if you don't do that, they're going to switch out the coaches every 2 or 3 years.
Right.
And again, there's many top schools that probably already have that as their top goal, and maybe they're judged against, like a Texas A&M. But I think even more schools are going to expect every year to get into that 12-team playoff. But ultimately, for the fans and for the sport, I think it's going to be great. And I think it's not going to happen very often, but there's going to be 1 out of 4 or 5 years where that 8th team that gets on a magical run and gets hot and potentially wins a national championship. And I think that is going to add something to the playoff as well, which I think will be pretty unique.
Yeah, I think that'll be compelling. So from a process standpoint, from what I understand, the committee's in a room, right? They narrow it down to 6 teams. They, out of those 6, they go around, they pick their top 3, and then once they get to their top 3, they start the process again with the remaining 3 to get their number 4. Is that correct?
Yeah, and I think you're hearing that a little bit, maybe just from bits and pieces, but I don't think that they, as far as I know, that's not the exact thing that they have to follow. I think
The
that's probably
recommendation.
the yes recommendation of how they get there. And again, part of the mystique is that we don't get to look inside that you talk about highest TV ratings in some of these games that have had very high TV ratings. If they would have had an hour of listening to the playoff committee trying to decide between Alabama, Georgia, and Florida State, I think would have been very intriguing to be able to hear. So there's a little bit of mystique in that you don't really know. ESPN gets to interview the chairman of the committee every year, and so you can learn a little bit there. But really, what's going on behind the scenes, I think there's different ways that different years that they get to those final 4 spots.
Yeah. Okay. So let's dive into the teams to start off with. I guess before we even go into the individual teams, do you think the committee got it right?
Yeah, I do. And I know there's a lot of people that disagree with that. I think when you and I were talking about, planning for this podcast, yesterday before the playoff teams were announced, both you and I kind of text each other who our 4 teams are that we think, are going to be in the playoff or that they're going to choose. And neither of us had Florida State in there.
Right.
And I can understand. I mean, this is a a very difficult situation for Florida State. I mean, they've been working towards this for the last, seems like 20 years to get back to a national championship, caliber team. And here they are, 13-0, and won the ACC. And this is the first time in the 10 years of the playoff. This is the first time that a undefeated Power 5 conference champion is left out of the playoffs. So I can understand, how rare this is and how disappointed Florida State is. But honestly, for people that are not looking through the, garnet and gold lens or the ACC lens, I'm honestly a little surprised at how many national people, believe the committee was wrong choosing Alabama over Florida State. But the reality is, I mean, this was like a 2% chance that all these things could line up and hurt Florida State the way they did. Number one, right, their starting quarterback gets hurt. Number two, the 2 games after Jordan Travis was hurt, they have 2 games and the backup quarterbacks because Tate Rodemaker played against Florida, and then Brock played Brock Glenn played, in this last game against Louisville. But I believe combined, they combined for 42.5% completion percentage. They were 20 of 47 combined in those two games, 42.5% completion percentage, 189 total passing yards, and no touchdowns, right, against two teams that I think Florida was, somewhere, ranked like maybe 55th,
Yeah,
maybe in
they're in the
passing
middle.
yards allowed, and Louisville was like 35th. So these weren't like the top two teams in the country. So not only did the quarterback get hurt, their backups come in, and it's a drastic drop off. And then you have a scenario where Alabama, who's again has one of the strongest reputations of success in the playoff, over in the playoff era over the last 10 years, that they have one loss, right, who happens to be to a playoff team in Texas, and they beat the number one team in the country. I mean, I think that's a lot of people aren't even talking about is Alabama had the best win out of all the teams. They beat the number one team in the country on the most important weekend for the college football playoffs, which is literally the day before they make their final selections for the four teams, right?
Yeah,
Because, I mean,
agreed.
the committee's sitting there, right, when they talk about who are the best four teams, they're watching all the conference championship games. They watch the Florida State Louisville game very closely. And again, I'm an ACC guy. I have, former, relationships with my dad coaching at Florida State, and obviously Clemson's my favorite school there, with my history going to school there and coaching there. But I love Florida State, but watching that Florida State Louisville game, I mean, it was hard to watch. I mean, it really was. And so you have the other quarterbacks come in, not play well. You've got, Alabama goes and beats Georgia, the number one team of the country, who, by the way, is on a 29 game winning streak.
Two consecutive national
Yeah,
championships.
two consecutive
Yeah,
national
that's not a
championships.
nothing win in the
Yeah.
SEC championship.
And with all that being said, most years the Big 12 and the Pac 12 would not have a playoff caliber team, ready. And
Right.
so all those things lined up. And I think it's really that like 1% to 2% chance that because all of that could have happened. And then, the Pac 12 not have a playoff team like has happened the majority of the years, and Florida State would be in. So I understand how hard it is for them, and really just you feel bad for them because they've worked extremely hard to get to that point. But if you truly kind of took off any biases, it's hard to think that an Alabama team with Milroe is not better than a Florida State team with their backup quarterback, and that's ultimately what I think the committee made their decision on.
Yeah, I agree with you. I was watching that Louisville game actually in my head thinking, even if they win, which they were most likely going to, I don't know how the committee puts them in. I think some of the national people that have really been, upset about this decision or kind of, behind Florida State in terms of they thought they should have been in. I think a lot of that kind of goes back to the historical context of the way the committee has chosen people in the past and the record weighing in. There was lots of years where we said, they put somebody in because of their record, and the other team with one loss was probably better. That team should have been in. So I think they made the right decision. I completely agree with you. I think they, for better or for worse in terms of what other people think, they did sit down and say, what are the four best football teams going into the playoff right now? And that's who should be going in, right? As the teams that have the best chance to win, the four best football teams. And I think one of the other things that, I don't think it's the biggest thing, but I think one of the other things that hurt Florida State is, the ACC as a conference without Clemson being a powerhouse this year. That Clemson win, I think if Clemson had been, an 11-win football team and Florida State had beat them too, it would have been harder not to put them in. But with Clemson having an average year, I think that was just one more strike on top of the fact that they lose Jordan Travis. They haven't performed very well the last two games. And I completely agree with you. I think right now Alabama's, if not might be the best football team going into this. So, because I've got some questions about the other ones too. But so with that being said, What did you think about the decision to put Michigan 1 versus Washington, two undefeated teams? What were your thoughts about those two things? Obviously, Michigan was ranked ahead, but I
Yeah.
didn't think it was a four. I obviously it was probably going to be, just move them on up. But do you think that was the right decision?
Yeah, I mean that is what would be unique to kind of listen to what the committee talks about between those two. I mean, honestly, I haven't followed those teams close enough to really be able. I mean, in my mind, and I know where we were at Clemson, whenever we were going to the playoffs, each year, it really didn't matter to us if you were 1, 2, 3, or 4. It was
You
just
just
like
wanted to
get
get
in.
in.
So
Yeah.
honestly, as I watched it, I mean, I think they could have had it, the other way, and I don't think obviously it would change maybe the matchup of who they're playing, but they're, typically each year there's not a huge difference between who's number 3 or who's number 4. But I think to me, just in what I've watched, I mean, Michigan has been dominant, right? And I mean, they've been dominant in a lot of games. Now the question is, some of the teams that they played in the conference and exactly how good they are. But I think you could have put Washington 1, Michigan 2, and I think people could have made a strong argument. So honestly, I didn't, that didn't bother me either way how that worked out, because the most important thing is to make the playoff, and then you're going to have a chance to be able to go figure out who's the best, and winning the next 2 games. But honestly, I haven't followed it close enough to be able to decipher between who should be number 1 or 2 in that setup.
So what about the because I had kind of told you that I was back and forth between does Georgia get in or Texas get in. Um, and so what were your thoughts on Texas versus Georgia getting in? Both one loss. Texas's loss was in the middle of the season. I believe it was Oklahoma State. Was that right?
Oklahoma.
Oklahoma.
Yep.
Okay. And then obviously Georgia's loss right there at the end in the SEC championship game against who might be the best football team in the country right now. What did you think about? And I know just from an optic standpoint, it would have been very difficult, I think, for the committee to put 2 one-loss teams in from the SEC and overlook, the Big 12 champion. So if you take that out of the equation, do you think they put the best football team
Yeah.
in Texas versus Georgia?
To me, again, I think that was going into it. That was, in my opinion, the biggest question. Where everybody else was thinking Florida State, Alabama.
Me too.
In my opinion, I thought it was Texas, Georgia was the biggest question.
And that's where I was vacillating.
Yeah,
When we were texting
yeah.
each other, you
Uh,
gave me the top 4 exactly the way they put it in, and I said I'm vacillating between Georgia and Texas.
Right. So I think people talk about this whole the 4 most deserving teams to be in, and the 4 best teams, and which one is it? And you hear a lot of times they talk about the best 4 teams, but in my opinion, I think it's like combination. They're looking at a combination of both of those, right? They have said that if you win your conference and you're a conference champion, like that is important to them. Like they factor that in, right?
Yeah,
And
it's in
so
the
I
equation.
think that was definitely a factor in that. So I think them choosing Texas over Georgia, really shows that this is a combination of deserving. Yes, they won their conference, all right, and they're also very talented. I mean, when you watch them again, they've had 1 loss to an Oklahoma team, but I mean, offensively, they've been very explosive in what they're doing. I think personally that they would have a hard time putting, leaving Texas out and putting Alabama in when Texas, beat Alabama by 10 at Alabama earlier this year. And so, I think for Alabama to get in, they needed Texas to be in, if that makes
Mm,
sense.
yeah.
But I think the argument could definitely be made, is Georgia, a better team than Texas. But I would say like that's so close that the conference championship for Texas is what edged it out, right? So you would say, best 4. You could make arguments between Georgia and Texas as far as who's better, and I think that's pretty even. But the conference championship pushed Texas above. Now, people would say, okay, well, you got to look at the same thing with Florida State, right? So you're saying, okay, Florida State and Alabama, right? They both won their conference, right? But Alabama is the better team right now for where they are in the season
Right.
with Milroe. And then, I think the other thing that's always been true when you're looking at the BCS or the playoff is it's better to lose early, right, and win late. Because ultimately, if we really get it down to the bare minimum and try to figure it out, the College Football Playoff Committee is trying to determine who are the best 4 teams at this stage of the season. That's ultimately what they're doing. Now,
Yeah.
you can't be, 9-3 and lose your first 3 games and then be, in that conversation because you're the best 4. But when you meet these minimum requirements of, only somewhere in that, 1 loss to undefeated, and there's that pool of maybe 6 teams, it's really who's playing the best at that time, but I think them factoring in a conference championship, goes. But I mean, going into last weekend, it's hard to think that if you would have said before the SEC championship game started that Georgia's going to lose by 3 and they're going to be out of the playoff, I think a lot of people would have had trouble with that. But as everything played out, it's hard getting one of those 4 spots, and so. I think one thing that's pretty interesting that I think hurts the Florida State argument is, Florida State's, number one, it's really hard for them that they got left out of the playoff. But number 2, they have to play Georgia, and so for them to like show everybody that they should have been in the playoff, here they are playing probably one of the most talented, 2 or 3 teams in the country, and look, again, the betting lines are not always 100% accurate, but they're more accurate than not. And I think Georgia opened up as a 14-point favorite over Florida State. So I think that speaks a little bit to, the decision on Florida State, where they are without their starting quarterback. But, personally, if Texas's loss was to anybody other than Alabama, or excuse me, if Texas would not have beat Alabama at Alabama, right,
Mm-hmm.
and had a key win, then I think that there would have been more of a case for Georgia to move in over them. But yeah, that would have been a big another whole nother deal with 2 1-loss SEC teams getting in. But honestly, I think a lot of that's talked about as far as the conferences and all that. And again, I'm an ACC guy. With my dad coaching at Florida State for so many years, coaching at Clemson, me playing and coaching at Clemson. I mean, I love the ACC and want to be partial to them. But at the end of the day, I do not think the people in that room of the College Football Playoff Committee, I don't think that they're trying to make decisions solely based on a conference. Now, does it factor in the strength of schedule and who they're playing each week and all that? Yes. But I really think their goal is to come up with the best 4 teams to enter the playoff.
Yeah. Well, when you look at strength of schedule, I mean, let's see. I got this here in front of me. Strength of schedule, Alabama's strength of schedule was 5th. Florida State's was 55th. Strength of, let's see. Oh, strength of record, meaning the teams they beat. Alabama was 4th. Florida State was 3rd. Georgia was 37th strength of schedule and 7th in strength of record. But I agree with you. I think at the end of the day, I think they put the right teams in. I do think that Georgia-Florida State game is probably going to settle that argument, because I would be very, very surprised if Florida State was able to win that football game. And I think the odds makers, though they're wrong sometimes, are usually pretty close to being right on a lot of these things. Let me ask you this question. This is just complete conjecture, so you can not conjecture if you choose not to. But let's say exact same scenario, but Clemson's there instead of Florida State, with the tradition that Clemson has. Same situation. Quarterback gets hurt. Does Clemson get in?
Yeah, that's a great question, because I do think that going to the other side of it, I do think the fact that it was Alabama, right, who had 1 loss and beat Georgia, I think that matters and brings.
Yeah, because if that's Ole Miss,
yeah, That's
Is it Ole
right.
Miss?
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's Ole Miss or Kentucky. I don't know that they get the
Oh,
exact same
right.
treatment there. But yeah, that's a good question. I think here's the other thing. I think it depends on how the backup quarterback. So if we're in the Clemson scenario, right, and same
Hmm.
scenario as Florida State, and the backup quarterback has to play the last two games. I mean, if they just do a good job, they don't have to go be the game breaker. For Florida State, I mean, if those guys would have gone in and been solid, and similar to how other teams have had their backup quarterbacks go in and do well, then I think it could be a different situation.
Go
But
beat Louisville 38-10 or something
yeah,
like
but
that.
I mean,
And show up on
literally,
offense.
yeah.
Yeah.
But these two guys, I mean, their stats were really really bad in both of those games, and also, I mean, it was hard to watch a little bit. Right now, part of that is the new college football environment that we're in with the transfer portal and all those things. I mean, most schools only have one quarterback, and that's part of having that championship run. Like Florida State had all the ingredients, to have that special season. But one of the most important ingredients is that your team stays healthy, and you could make an argument that the quarterback is the most important, not just position right on the field, obviously, but even more important than the head coach. I think that's unique, right? If you look at Michigan playing 6 games this year, without Harbaugh, right? And they didn't miss a beat. And then, you take the starting quarterback out on a team like Florida State, and it was noticeably a different, offense and different team.
Yeah.
But yeah,
But
that's a
play
good question
have
on the
Michigan
Clemson deal.
have Michigan keep Harbaugh for six
Yeah,
games, but play those same 6 games without JJ McCarthy.
right. Yeah, I mean that's a very valid question. But yeah, to answer your deal on Clemson, to me, it would have depended on how's the backup quarterback. If the backup quarterback's 42% and 180 yards and no touchdowns, then and Alabama did what they did, then I could see them doing the exact same thing. But I do agree there's definitely some brand equity, if you will, and I think we saw that a little bit with the Alabama situation. And Alabama, I mean, they play well at the end of the year, right? I mean, Alabama very legitimately could win the national championship this year. And based off what happened there in the Iron Bowl in the last second, it just feels like it's a little bit of a team of destiny. So I would not be surprised at all if Alabama wins the whole thing. And that would be, pretty interesting to go back and look at what happened, these last 2 weeks leading up to that for them to get into the playoff.
Yeah, I think I would agree with your answer. I think if Florida State, either one of those backup quarterbacks had really turned things on and they had scored, 35, 40 points a game, both games, it would have been much harder to not put them in. So looking forward to where we are now with a Michigan-Alabama matchup, a Washington-Texas matchup, let's just take a quick look at those two games and get your initial thoughts on, let's talk Michigan-Alabama first.
Yeah. Well, we're going to find out about Michigan if this year's Michigan team is different from the previous Michigan teams the last few years. Right? They have a great regular season, dominate everybody in their conference, and then get to the playoff and they're one and done and they're out. Just watching some games this year. I mean, this Michigan team, it's hard to argue that they're not the best team in the country. And we're going to find out right on the competition right out the gate versus Alabama. I mean, these are obviously two of the most historic programs in all of college football. I think they're two of the best coaches in our current environment, and Harbaugh and Coach Saban, and both teams very physical. I mean, this is going to be a slugfest type of game with the physicality at the line of scrimmage. And then also, I mean, they got skill guys on both sides. I think this is going to be an incredible game. And again, that kind of goes back to what we were talking about, the right teams being chosen. I think Michigan opened as a 2-point favorite at this point right now, a month out. But the biggest question is going to be, is Michigan for real this year, or is this a similar situation where they're just the best team in their conference, but not quite elite versus some of the other national elite teams.
Yeah, I think my biggest question with Michigan is kind of the same thing that we've seen with them in the playoffs recently is they're able to go through the Big Ten and pretty much impose their will on everybody in the running game. And then they can pick and choose when they throw it, and they don't get pushed into long yardage situations very frequently. And then if you compare that to last year, where their entire running game got shut down and they forced them to pass, forced them to throw the ball to win, they were unable to do it. And obviously, I mean, Nick Saban's one of the best football coaches, that's ever been around. That's what's going to happen, right? They're going to try to take away the running game and say, beat us throwing the football. So the real question is, in my mind, can Michigan do that? Because that's what I think you're going to see. And so you're going to get a lot put on JJ McCarthy, who I think is a really talented quarterback, but he has less than 25 starts under his belt. I mean, he's started the last 2 years, done very, very well. But their passing game is built off of the majority of it's built off of play action, off of some kind of backfield action, whether it's motion, something like that. And it's built off the running game. Very rarely do you see them get into 4 wides, 5 wides, spread the field, try to really stretch you hard vertically. It's usually off of some kind of backfield action. So, when you really put 8, 9 guys up in the box, is JJ McCarthy going to be able to beat you? That's how I look at it.
I agree with that. I think that's a good assessment. And then the other thing I would say is, 2 very talented defenses and talented teams all the way around. But Milroe is kind of that different, that wild card, if you will.
Yeah.
And he makes plays when plays aren't there. I mean, obviously, we can see how well he runs and creates plays that when things break down. And again, when you're playing a really good defense that has a good pass rush, and all of a sudden, they think they have a sack, and now it turns into a 28-yard gain because the guy's just super athletic. So we know how athletic he is, but then to be able to see some of the throws that he does make, and I think, one of the best coaching jobs or just overall improvement in the season is from where Milroe was at the beginning of the year,
Right.
and literally being benched for the South Florida game to now where he is. And I mean, that throw that he made on the last play of the Iron Bowl, that was not
insane, right?
Yeah,
that wasn't just to throw it up in the air.
no,
That was an amazing throw.
that literally, I mean, you're like putting a trash can right there and saying you got to throw it perfectly,
Yeah.
in that situation. That showed his, arm strength, and also just his overall, the it factor, if you will, being in that situation. So I could see him potentially being the difference in the game. You're literally talking about a 1-score game, and he's different than JJ McCarthy for sure in some of those areas.
Yeah. So what about Texas and Washington? To be honest with you, I have not seen Washington play a whole lot just because of the schedule. I did go back and, watch key plays from some of their primary games, but what are your thoughts on that one?
Well, being a former wide receiver guy, that's definitely one matchup of 2 of the best wide receiver cores in the country. I mean, Washington is very explosive. I've been impressed with their physicality watching some of their games this year, which maybe when you just kind of hear Penix and the wideouts, you just assume that they're just kind of a pass happy team. But they've been really physical running the football, but very explosive in the passing game. And when I go back to kind of my experience and being at Clemson and all those playoff games and 2 national championships, I mean, you got to be able to score in the playoffs. And having Deshaun Watson and then Trevor Lawrence to go with all those freaks we had at wideout. I mean, that's one of the recipes that it does take, along with a great defense and an overall, team, and those type of things. But to me, the thing that stands out here is both of these teams can score. They got, quarterbacks that are playing very well. They got really good playmakers at receiver. I think it's going to be a fun kind of shootout. I think both of these games are going to be a little bit different. I think Michigan, Alabama is going to be more of your old school kind of traditional lower score game because of the defenses and offenses, that again can score but not set up this way. I think Washington, Texas. I think there's going to be a lot of fireworks in that game with two explosive quarterbacks and passing games. But one thing that I think also is going to be interesting is, neither Washington or Texas have been in, this situation very much at all. I believe this is Texas's first year in the playoff, and probably Washington's maybe as well. So, that's a whole different stage, and who's kind of prepared for that moment, because it is. I mean, it feels a lot different than a regular bowl game when you know that, hey, the winner of this game is going to earn a berth to the national championship game. Watching how those quarterbacks and those teams handle that second half of that game, I think will be really interesting.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think I looked at Texas. I think they only scored below 30 points twice the entire season, and I think Washington is the same way. I don't know what their actual point per game average, but you've got two really explosive offensive teams. So they are a little bit different, right? Penix can do a lot more with his legs, but he's still, he's not just a guy who runs. He's a good quarterback, whereas Ewers is, more of a drop back pocket type of guy, but he's got a lot of weapons, on the outside along with that tight end they've got. So that's a game that I know the Alabama Michigan game is going to get tons of hype because they're two, powerhouses and national traditions. But I think that Texas Washington game is going to be a really, really fun game to watch.
Yeah, no, I agree. And again, it goes back to what we talked about, at the very beginning of this podcast, and really what was talked about all day yesterday. And we're talking about how good these matchups are, right? And I think that proves that the playoff committee got it right. I mean, if we're inserting Florida State in any one of these, it's hard for us to make a case that Florida State's going to score a bunch of points and have a chance to win the game. So I think, when you really get down to looking at these matchups, I think it really, kind of proves that the committee got it right.
Yeah. All right. Well, hey, man, I appreciate you jumping on here with me kind of last minute Monday morning, but I was eager to talk to you about this. I know that there's a lot of people that'll be looking forward to hearing your insights, so I'm going to make sure we get this thing up quickly so people can tune into this one. But thanks for your time this morning, Jeff.
Absolutely. Sounds good. Let's do it again.